This is the most dangerous psychopath I've ever had in my courtroom, and he said it for no other reason, because he appears to be just the opposite of what he really is. And he said, I feel you'll always be a danger to women.
There are thousands of missing person cases in America. Most begin the same way. Someone leaves home and never comes back. But the case you're about to hear was different, because this young woman didn't disappear forever. She came home, alive, after 7 years, which should have been the end of the story. Instead, it became the beginning of a mystery that investigators struggled to explain. Because when detectives finally learned what had happened, one question refused to go away. Why didn't she run? Not once, not twice, but during several moments when escape seemed possible. The answer wasn't a locked door, it wasn't a chain, and it wasn't fear alone. It was something far more disturbing. To understand how that could happen, we have to travel back to May 19th, 1977. Long before the headlines, long before the courtroom, back to a quiet stretch of highway where a single decision changed one young woman's life forever. Her name was Colleen Stan. She was just 20 years old. Friends described her as independent, kind, and adventurous. She loved the outdoors and wasn't afraid to travel. Like many young people in the 1970s, she believed the world was full of opportunities, and that, more often than not, people were willing to help one another. It was a different time. Seatbelts weren't always worn. Front doors were often left unlocked. And for many young travelers, hitchhiking wasn't considered reckless. It was simply how you got from one place to another. That morning, Colleen planned to travel from Oregon to Northern California to attend a friend's birthday gathering. It wasn't an unusual trip. She packed lightly, said goodbye, and started making her way south. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be remembered nearly 50 years later. As the hours passed, several cars slowed down. Drivers offered her a ride. But Colleen trusted her instincts. She politely refused some of them. Something didn't feel right. That detail may not seem important now, but investigators would later return to it again and again, because it proved something many people still misunderstand about this case. Colleen wasn't careless. She was cautious. She did listen to her instincts. She simply encountered someone who understood exactly how to disarm them. Eventually, another vehicle appeared. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't a man driving alone. It was a family. A blue van rolled to a stop. Behind the wheel was a man named Cameron Hooker. In the passenger seat sat his wife, Janice. Their infant daughter was with them. Take a moment and imagine that scene. You're standing beside a highway. A husband, a wife, a baby. Compared with every ride she'd turned down earlier that day, which one would seem safer? For Colleen, the answer was obvious. Families don't usually make people feel afraid. They make people feel protected. That first impression would become one of the most important details in the entire case. Because trust can sometimes be built in seconds and destroyed just as quickly. Cameron introduced himself politely. Janice appeared calm. Nothing about the conversation immediately raised alarm. There were no threats, no shouting, no obvious signs of danger. Just a family offering to help a young traveler continue her journey. If another driver had looked into that van as it pulled away, they would have seen something completely ordinary. A husband driving, a wife beside him, a baby, and a hitchhiker grateful for a ride. No one passing them that afternoon could have imagined they were looking at the beginning of one of the most psychologically disturbing kidnapping cases in American history. Because the danger wasn't visible, it was sitting behind the wheel, and within the next few miles, everything Colleen believed about the people around her was about to change forever. But here's what makes this story even more unsettling. The kidnapping itself wasn't the reason investigators would remember this case. It was what happened after it. And that's where this story takes a turn almost no one sees coming. As the van continued south, the atmosphere remained almost unsettlingly normal. Cameron asked ordinary questions. Where was she headed? How long had she been traveling? What did she do for fun? Nothing about the conversation suggested that Colleen was in danger. Janice occasionally joined in. Their baby sat quietly nearby. It looked exactly like the kind of ride thousands of young hitchhikers accepted during the 1970s. And that's precisely what made this case so terrifying. Because danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it smiles, it makes small talk, and it waits. If you've ever wondered how someone can end up in a nightmare without realizing it, this case may answer that question better than almost any other. As the miles passed, the traffic became lighter. The busy roads gave way to quieter stretches of highway. Then, Cameron suggested taking a different route. It sounded reasonable. Just a small detour. A shortcut. Nothing that immediately caused alarm. For Colleen, there was still no obvious reason to panic. She wasn't trapped in the way most people imagine. She wasn't surrounded by masked strangers. She was sitting with what still appeared to be an ordinary family. That's an important detail, because many people believe they would instantly recognize a dangerous person. But history has shown that's rarely how these cases begin. The most successful predators often rely on something far more powerful than force. They rely on trust, and Cameron Hooker understood that better than almost anyone. Then, without warning, everything changed. The friendly conversation stopped. The calm atmosphere vanished. In an instant, Cameron revealed the violent control he had been hiding behind that ordinary smile. Within moments, Colleen realized the ride she thought would take her to a birthday celebration had become something else entirely, a fight for survival. Investigators would later discover that this wasn't a random burst of violence. There were signs Cameron had been fantasizing about abducting and controlling women long before he crossed paths with Colleen. To him, this wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the beginning of a plan that would stretch far beyond days or weeks. As the reality of her situation sank in, Colleen faced a terrifying truth. No one knew exactly where she was. No one had seen what had happened. And with every passing mile, the chances of someone stumbling across her grew smaller. Back home, her family had no reason to panic yet. They believed she was simply traveling, living her life, enjoying the trip she'd been looking forward to. They had no way of knowing that, at that very moment, everything had changed. Days would pass before concern began to grow. Then concern would become fear. And eventually, silence. For the people who loved Colleen, it would seem as though she had simply vanished. But the reality was far worse. She hadn't disappeared. She was alive, hidden, and about to become trapped in a system of control so psychologically complex that, years later, seasoned investigators would struggle to understand how one man had managed to maintain it. Because Cameron Hooker wasn't relying on chains alone. He was preparing something far more dangerous, something almost invisible, a weapon that couldn't be photographed, couldn't be fingerprinted, and couldn't be broken with a key. He intended to take control of her mind. In Chapter 2, Cameron's true method of control begins to unfold, and it will challenge everything you think you know about why victims stay, why they don't run, and how psychological manipulation can become as powerful as any prison. Most kidnappings follow a pattern. The victim is restrained, hidden, guarded. Every escape is blocked by locks, chains, or walls. But investigators would eventually discover that Cameron Hooker was building something far more effective. A prison that didn't need any of those things. And once it was complete, Colleen would begin believing that escape was impossible, even when opportunities appeared. That didn't happen overnight. It happened one decision, one threat, one lie at a time. In the hours after the kidnapping, Cameron made one thing painfully clear. He wasn't interested in ransom. He wasn't trying to negotiate. He wanted complete control, not just over Colleen's body, but over every decision she would make from that day forward. The fear was immediate. The uncertainty was overwhelming. She had no idea where she was, no idea if anyone was looking for her, and no idea what Cameron planned to do next. For anyone in that situation, survival becomes the only priority. You stop thinking about tomorrow. You focus on the next minute, then the next hour. That instinct to survive is something investigators say many people underestimate when judging victims from the outside. Because it's easy to ask, why didn't she fight? It's much harder to answer that question when your life depends on making the wrong person believe you're no longer a threat. But Cameron wasn't relying on fear alone. Fear fades. People adapt. He needed something stronger. Something that would keep working even when he wasn't standing beside her. So he began constructing a reality that existed only inside Colleen's mind. And this is where the case takes a turn, unlike almost any other. Over time, Cameron convinced Colleen that he belonged to a powerful underground organization he called the Company. According to him, this secret group watched everything. It had members everywhere. If she tried to escape, if she spoke to police, if she trusted the wrong person, the company would find her. And worse, it would punish the people she loved. There was no evidence such an organization existed. Investigators would later determine it was a fabrication, a carefully built illusion. But Colleen didn't know that. She had every reason to believe the threats were real. Think about that for a moment. If someone convinced you that an invisible organization was watching your every move, and that one mistake could cost your family their lives, would every unlocked door still feel like freedom? Or would it feel like a trap? That question became the heart of this entire investigation, because Cameron wasn't simply controlling where Colleen went. He was controlling what she believed, and belief can become stronger than steel. As weeks turned into months, the psychological pressure only intensified. The threats never had to be repeated loudly. They didn't have to. Once fear settles deep enough into someone's mind, it begins speaking for the person who created it. That was Cameron's real weapon. Not violence alone, not isolation alone, but manipulation so relentless that it started replacing Colleen's own instincts with his version of reality. To anyone looking from the outside, nothing about it made sense. But investigators would later realize they weren't looking at an ordinary kidnapping. They were looking at years of deliberate psychological conditioning. And the most unsettling discovery was still ahead, because before long, Colleen would be taken somewhere that Cameron intended to become her entire world, a place so unimaginable that even experienced detectives struggled to comprehend how anyone could survive there. And in the next chapter, we'll step inside that world, a place where time seemed to stop, hope slowly disappeared, and every day became another test of whether the human spirit could endure the unimaginable. If you've made it this far, you might still be asking the same question investigators asked for years. How could someone survive this? The truth: survival didn't happen because the days became easier. It happened because Colleen adapted to a reality no one should ever have to endure. And that's exactly what Cameron wanted. By now, his control wasn't built on a single threat. It was built on routine. Routine has a strange effect on the human mind. Days blur into weeks. Weeks become months. And eventually, what once felt impossible can begin to feel like normal life. For Colleen, that transformation was one of the most devastating parts of her captivity. She was no longer thinking about how to escape every waking moment. She was thinking about how to survive the next day, then the next, then the one after that. But here's what makes this case so difficult to understand. Cameron didn't keep Colleen hidden every second of every day. There were moments when she wasn't completely isolated, moments that, on paper, looked like opportunities to escape. She was sometimes allowed outside under Cameron's control. At times, she interacted with other people. She wasn't always behind a locked door. To someone hearing those facts for the first time, the obvious question is, why didn't she run? That question followed this case for decades. But investigators eventually realized they had been asking the wrong question. The better question was, what had Cameron done to make escape feel more dangerous than staying? By then, years of manipulation had taken hold. Colleen believed that, The company was real. She believed people were watching. She believed that if she tried to flee, innocent people, including members of her own family, could be harmed. Those beliefs weren't based on reality. But to Colleen, they were reality. And people don't make decisions based only on facts. They make decisions based on what they sincerely believe to be true. That's what made Cameron's control so powerful. It didn't depend on being in the same room. It traveled with her, everywhere. Even so, something unexpected was beginning to happen inside the Hooker household. Not with Cameron, with Janice. For years, Janice had lived under Cameron's influence as well. Investigators would later learn that she, too, had experienced manipulation and control within the relationship. That doesn't erase her responsibility for choices she made. But it does help explain why the situation inside the house was far more complicated than it first appeared. As the years passed, cracks began to form. The version of reality Cameron had built was becoming harder to maintain. Janice's silence was no longer as certain as it once had been. And Cameron, despite all his efforts to control every detail, was about to make a mistake. It wasn't a dramatic mistake. It wasn't a chase. It wasn't a piece of forensic evidence. It was something much quieter. Something that started with doubt. Because the strongest prison Cameron ever built was beginning to crack from the inside. In Chapter 4, one confession changes everything, and after 7 unimaginable years, Colleen is finally faced with a choice she never thought she'd have to make: walk away, or keep believing the lie that had controlled her life for so long. For nearly 7 years, Cameron Hooker had convinced Colleen that one wrong move would cost innocent people their lives. Not because of him, but because of the company, the invisible organization he claimed had eyes everywhere. By this point, that lie had become more than a story. It had become the foundation of Colleen's reality. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, every moment she hesitated, was shaped by a fear Cameron had carefully built over years. And that's what makes what happened next so extraordinary. The prison didn't fall because Cameron suddenly became weaker. It fell because the one person who had helped maintain his illusion could no longer live with it. That person was Janice Hooker. For years, Janice had remained by Cameron's side. To outsiders, it was difficult to understand why, but investigators would later uncover a household shaped by manipulation, fear, and control that affected more than one person. Again, that doesn't erase responsibility, but it helps explain why the situation inside that home was far more complex than it appeared. Then, something changed. Janice's guilt had been growing for years. She had watched Colleen lose nearly everything: her freedom, her family, 7 years of her life, and eventually, the weight of that reality became impossible to ignore. One day away from Cameron, Janice told Colleen something that shattered everything she'd believed. The company didn't exist. There was no secret organization, no network of people watching her every move, no hidden group waiting to punish her family. It had all been a lie Cameron had created, a lie he had repeated so many times that it became more convincing than the truth itself. Imagine hearing that after 7 years. The fear that had controlled every decision, every missed opportunity, every silent moment, had been built on something that wasn't real. It's almost impossible to understand what that realization must have felt like. Relief, confusion, disbelief, and one overwhelming question. If the company wasn't real, what else had Cameron lied about? That single conversation changed everything. For the first time in years, Colleen could see cracks in the world Cameron had built around her. But seeing the truth and acting on it were two very different things. Years of psychological manipulation don't disappear in a single afternoon. Even when someone tells you the prison door is open, you may still believe it's safer to stay inside. And Cameron made one final miscalculation. Convinced that his control over Colleen was complete, he allowed her to leave. He believed she would return. Or, if she didn't, he believed she would never tell anyone what had happened. It was a gamble built on years of conditioning, and for a brief moment, it almost worked. Colleen reunited with her family, a reunion they had once feared would never happen. To them, she was finally home, but the story wasn't over, because coming home meant facing a decision that was every bit as difficult as surviving. Should she stay silent, or should she tell the world what had happened? That choice wouldn't just determine Cameron Hooker's future. It would finally reveal the truth behind one of the most disturbing kidnapping cases in American history. In the final chapter, Colleen breaks her silence. Investigators uncover the full extent of Cameron's crimes, and a courtroom hears a story so extraordinary that many struggled to believe it was real, until the evidence spoke for itself. For 7 years, Cameron Hooker had controlled nearly every part of Colleen Stan's life. Now, for the first time, he had lost control of the one thing that mattered most: her voice. But speaking the truth wasn't as simple as walking into a police station. Imagine carrying 7 years of fear, 7 years of manipulation, 7 years of believing that powerful people might still be watching. Even after learning that the company wasn't real, the psychological effects of those threats didn't disappear overnight. That's something many people misunderstand about trauma. Leaving the situation doesn't always mean the fear leaves with you. Eventually, Colleen made the decision that changed everything. She told her family what had happened. Then she spoke to investigators. At first, parts of her story seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The years of captivity, the elaborate psychological manipulation, the fabricated organization Cameron had used to control her. But as detectives investigated further, the evidence and witness accounts began to support what she had endured. The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't simply a kidnapping. It was a carefully maintained system of coercion and control that had lasted for years. As the investigation moved forward, another crucial witness came forward: Janice Hooker. Her testimony became a significant part of the case against Cameron. She described years of abuse and manipulation within their relationship and provided investigators with important details about what had happened to Colleen. In 1985, Cameron Hooker was arrested. The case eventually went to trial. Jurors were confronted with facts unlike almost anything they had heard before. They had to understand not only what had happened, but how one man had maintained control for so long. The answer wasn't a single chain. It wasn't a single threat. It was years of psychological domination, reinforced over time until fear shaped nearly every decision. When the verdict was delivered, Cameron Hooker was found guilty of multiple crimes related to the kidnapping and abuse of Colleen Stan. He received a lengthy prison sentence. For Colleen, however, no verdict could return the 7 years that had been taken from her. Justice in a courtroom can punish the person responsible. It cannot erase what someone survived. And yet, Colleen chose not to let those years define the rest of her life. Over time, she rebuilt relationships with her family, worked toward healing, and spoke publicly about her experience to help others understand the realities of psychological coercion and survival. Her story challenged assumptions that many people held about victims. It showed that captivity isn't measured only by walls or locked doors. Sometimes the strongest prison exists inside a person's mind, built through fear, isolation, and manipulation. That lesson continues to influence how investigators, psychologists, and the public think about coercive control today. Looking back, it's easy to ask, would I have escaped? But after hearing the full story, perhaps the more honest question is this: would I have recognized the prison if I couldn't see its walls? Because Cameron Hooker's greatest weapon wasn't simply violence. It was his ability to convince another human being that hope itself was dangerous. And that's why, decades later, the case of Colleen Stan remains one of the most haunting examples of psychological control in modern true crime. If there's one thing her story leaves us with, it's this: never judge a survivor by the choices they made while trying to stay alive. Until you've lived through what they endured, you can't truly know what survival demanded of them. And perhaps that's the most important truth this case has to teach. Thank you for watching Redwire Archive. If this documentary gave you a new perspective on one of the most extraordinary true crime cases ever documented, consider subscribing. Every week we uncover real stories where the truth is often stranger than fiction and always grounded in the facts.